Sometimes the smallest person in the room carries the biggest surprise. In a world where physical strength often determines who stands and who falls, one woman was about to rewrite the rules in front of hundreds of witnesses. What happened that day on a military base would become legend, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned that respect isn't given based on size, gender, or rank. It's earned through courage, skill, and the unbreakable spirit of someone who refuses to be a victim. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a 54 combat medic who faced down a 62 drill sergeant in front of 500 soldiers. What followed would shock everyone present and forever change how an entire military base viewed the quiet woman who had been underestimated for far too long. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes justice arrives in the form of a perfectly executed defensive move that no one saw coming. Sarah Martinez had been invisible for most of her military career, and she preferred it that way. At 26 years old, she moved through the corridors of Fort Braxton like a shadow, her small frame easily overlooked among the towering figures of her fellow soldiers. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing just over 120 pounds, she had learned early in her service that being noticed often meant being targeted. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed to perfection, and her eyes kept downcast when passing the more aggressive members of her unit. The base was home to nearly 3,000 active personnel, but Sarah knew her place in the hierarchy. As a combat medic, she was respected for her skills when soldiers needed her expertise, but forgotten the moment their wounds were treated. She had served 2 tours overseas, saved countless lives under enemy fire, and earned commendations that gathered dust in her footlocker. Yet none of that seemed to matter when certain people looked at her and saw only weakness disguised in army fatigues. Sergeant First Class Marcus Brennan was one of those people. At 6 feet 2 inches and 240 pounds of solid muscle, he commanded attention wherever he went. His voice could be heard 3 buildings away when he was conducting drills, and his reputation for breaking down recruits was legendary throughout the base. Brennan had been at Fort Braxton for 8 years, working his way up through the ranks by sheer intimidation and an iron fist approach to discipline. He believed that the military was no place for weakness, and in his mind, anyone who couldn't physically dominate their environment had no business wearing the uniform. For months, Brennan had made Sarah's life increasingly difficult. It started small, as these things often do. Comments about her size during formation, suggestions that she might be better suited for civilian work, deliberate scheduling that put her on the worst shifts with the most demanding duties. Sarah endured it all with quiet dignity, knowing that responding would only escalate the situation. She had seen what happened to soldiers who challenged Brennan's authority, and she had no desire to become his next target for systematic destruction. But Brennan's campaign against Sarah wasn't random cruelty. He genuinely believed that soldiers like her made the entire unit weaker. In his experience, small women cracked under pressure, became liabilities in combat situations, and put their fellow soldiers at risk. He had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had seen good men die because someone couldn't pull their weight when it mattered most. In his twisted logic, making Sarah's life miserable was actually a service to her future teammates who might depend on her in life-or-death situations. What Brennan didn't know was that Sarah Martinez carried secrets that would have shocked him to his core. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she had been raised by her grandmother, Maria Santos, a woman who had survived the streets through sheer toughness and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to disappear. Maria had insisted that her granddaughter learn to defend herself, not through traditional self-defense classes, but through something much more comprehensive and deadly. From the age of 8 until she enlisted at 18, Sarah had studied Filipino martial arts under Master Carlos Delgado, a man who had learned his skills in the mountains of Luzon during World War II. Kali, arnis, and eskrima became as natural to her as breathing. The flowing movements, the devastating joint locks, the precise strikes designed to end fights in seconds rather than minutes. Master Delgado had taught her that size was an illusion, that proper technique could overcome any physical disadvantage, and that the most dangerous fighters were often those who looked the least threatening. But Sarah had made a conscious decision when she joined the military to keep these skills hidden. She had watched too many soldiers get into trouble because they couldn't resist showing off their abilities. She had seen fights break out over minor disputes that escalated into court-martial proceedings. Better to be underestimated and safe than respected and constantly challenged by every tough guy who wanted to test themselves against her abilities. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days saving the lives of soldiers who might not have respected her enough to watch her back in combat. She treated their wounds with hands that could have broken their bones, listened to their complaints with patience that came from knowing she could end their suffering in ways they couldn't imagine. But Sarah had principles that went deeper than her martial arts training. She was a healer first, a fighter only when absolutely necessary. The base operated on a complex social structure that had little to do with official rank and everything to do with personality, physical presence, and reputation. Brennan sat near the top of this unofficial hierarchy, his combination of size, skill, and ruthless ambition making him someone that even officers treated with careful respect. Sarah existed somewhere near the bottom, her medical expertise providing her with just enough value to avoid being completely dismissed, but not enough to shield her from the daily indignities that Brennan seemed to enjoy inflicting. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late September. The entire base was preparing for a major readiness exercise that would be observed by senior command from the Pentagon. Every soldier was under increased pressure to perform flawlessly, and tensions were running higher than usual. Sarah had been assigned to a medical station that would serve the central training area, where nearly 500 soldiers would be conducting various drills and demonstrations throughout the day. She arrived early, as always, to set up her equipment and review the medical protocols for the exercises. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sounds of soldiers preparing for what would be one of the most important evaluations of their careers. Sarah took pride in her preparation, ensuring that every bandage was properly placed, every medication properly labeled, every piece of equipment tested and ready for immediate use. Brennan appeared just as she was finishing her setup, his massive frame blocking the morning sun as he approached her station. He wasn't alone. Behind him walked Corporal Jimmy Walsh and Private First Class Derek Chen, two soldiers who had learned that staying in Brennan's good graces meant participating in his campaigns against those he deemed unworthy. Sarah had treated both men for various injuries over the months, had always been professional and competent in her care, but that professional relationship meant nothing in the face of their loyalty to Brennan. The conversation started innocuously enough. Brennan questioned her setup, suggested that her medical station might be better positioned elsewhere, implied that she might not be ready for the demands of such an important day. Sarah responded politely but firmly, explaining that her positioning had been approved by the base medical officer and that relocating now would compromise her ability to respond quickly to emergencies during the exercises. Other soldiers began to take notice as Brennan's voice grew louder and more aggressive. This wasn't unusual behavior from him, but the timing and location made it more significant. The central training area was like a stage, visible from multiple vantage points around the base. Any confrontation here would be witnessed by hundreds of soldiers, and word would spread quickly through the ranks about what transpired. Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Backing down would confirm Brennan's assessment that she was weak and unworthy of respect. But standing her ground meant escalating a confrontation with someone who had the size, rank, and reputation to destroy her military career. She chose to maintain her professional demeanor while quietly preparing herself for whatever might come next. The crowd of observers grew as Brennan continued his verbal assault. Soldiers stopped their own preparations to watch what was quickly becoming the most dramatic confrontation many of them had ever witnessed on base. Sarah could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, waiting to see if the quiet medic would finally crack under the pressure that Brennan was applying with surgical precision. What happened next would be remembered and retold for decades to come. Brennan, perhaps emboldened by his audience or frustrated by Sarah's refusal to back down, made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He stepped closer, his massive frame towering over her small figure, and in a voice loud enough for everyone in the area to hear clearly, he delivered an ultimatum that crossed every line of military protocol and human decency. The words he spoke would echo across the base within hours, but more importantly, they would trigger a response from Sarah Martinez that nobody present could have anticipated. The quiet medic who had spent years being invisible was about to become the center of the most legendary confrontation in Fort Braxton's history. As Brennan raised his voice for what he intended to be his final, crushing verbal blow, Sarah made a decision that had been building inside her for months. She was done being invisible, done being a target, done allowing someone else's insecurities and prejudices to dictate how she was treated. The woman who had spent years hiding her true capabilities was about to reveal exactly why Master Delgado had always warned his students that the most dangerous fighters were those who looked the least threatening. Crowd sensed that something significant was about to happen. The morning air grew still, as if the entire base was holding its breath. In moments like these, legends are born and lives are forever changed. Sarah Martinez was about to become both the hero and the subject of a story that would be told and retold for generations of soldiers who would learn that respect isn't given based on size or gender, but earned through courage, skill, and the unbreakable spirit of someone who refuses to be broken. The morning sun climbed higher as more soldiers gathered around the central training area, drawn by the unmistakable tension radiating from the confrontation between Sergeant Brennan and the small medic. Word was spreading through the base like wildfire that something significant was happening, and off-duty personnel began appearing from barracks and administrative buildings to witness what was quickly becoming the most dramatic scene many had ever observed during their service. Sarah stood perfectly still as Brennan's verbal assault intensified, her medical training kicking in as she monitored her own physiological responses. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled, her muscles relaxed but ready. Years of treating wounded soldiers under extreme stress had taught her to maintain calm in chaotic situations, and the techniques that kept her steady while saving lives under enemy fire served her well as she faced down the most intimidating soldier on the base. Brennan seemed to interpret her calm as evidence of the weakness he had always suspected. In his experience, truly tough soldiers would have responded to his aggression with matching intensity, would have stepped forward rather than remaining motionless, would have shown some sign that they were prepared to defend themselves. Sarah's stillness convinced him that she was paralyzed by fear, that his campaign of intimidation had finally achieved its intended effect of breaking her spirit. The crowd continued to grow as soldiers from across the base converged on the training area. Captain Rebecca Torres, the base medical officer and Sarah's direct supervisor, pushed through the crowd with growing alarm as she realized what was happening. She had known Sarah for 3 years, had watched her perform under impossible conditions during 2 combat deployments, and had recommended her for commendations that reflected her extraordinary skill and courage under fire. The idea that anyone would question Sarah's worthiness to serve was incomprehensible to her. Major William Harrison, the officer responsible for overseeing the day's exercises, arrived just as Brennan escalated his verbal attack to include personal insults about Sarah's appearance, her competence, and her right to wear the uniform. Harrison had 30 years of military experience and had never seen a senior enlisted soldier so publicly humiliate a subordinate without cause. But stopping the confrontation immediately might make Brennan look weak in front of the assembled crowd, potentially undermining his authority and effectiveness as a drill instructor. What none of the observers understood was the internal calculation taking place inside Sarah's mind. Master Delgado had taught her to assess every potential threat along multiple dimensions: physical capability, psychological state, tactical positioning, environmental factors, and exit strategies. As she stood facing Brennan's aggression, she was conducting a complete threat analysis that would have impressed military intelligence specialists. Brennan's size and strength were obvious advantages, but Sarah noted the subtle signs that suggested his physical conditioning might not be as perfect as it appeared. His breathing was slightly elevated despite the lack of physical exertion, indicating possible cardiovascular limitations. His stance was too aggressive, committing too much weight forward and creating vulnerabilities that a skilled fighter could exploit. Most importantly, his emotional state was compromised by anger and the need to perform for his audience, clouding his judgment and making him predictable. The environmental factors were mixed. The hard-packed earth of the training area would provide solid footing for any physical confrontation, but the crowd of observers created both opportunities and dangers. Witnesses would ensure that any action she took would be scrutinized by military investigators, but they would also prevent Brennan from claiming later that events had unfolded differently than they actually had. Sarah's internal timer told her that the confrontation had been building for approximately 12 minutes, which meant that senior officers would soon intervene to prevent the situation from escalating further. If she was going to act, it would need to be soon, and it would need to be decisive. Half measures would only prolong the situation and potentially make things worse for everyone involved. The trigger moment came when Brennan made a tactical error that Master Delgado had always warned his students to watch for in aggressive opponents. Frustrated by Sarah's refusal to react to his verbal assault, and perhaps emboldened by what he perceived as her weakness, Brennan stepped directly into her personal space and raised his right leg in preparation for what appeared to be a pushing kick aimed at her midsection. The attack was not intended to cause serious injury, but rather to humiliate her by knocking her backward onto the ground in front of hundreds of witnesses. In Brennan's mind, this would be the final demonstration of her unsuitability for military service, the moment when she would be exposed as too weak and unprepared to defend herself or anyone else. What Brennan didn't realize was that his telegraphed attack had just activated 18 years of martial arts training that had been dormant but never forgotten. Sarah's body responded with muscle memory so deeply ingrained that conscious thought played no role in what happened next. The quiet medic who had spent months being invisible was about to demonstrate exactly why Master Delgado had always insisted that the most dangerous fighters were those who looked the least threatening. As Brennan's leg began its upward trajectory toward her torso, Sarah moved with a speed and precision that shocked every observer. Instead of stepping backward or attempting to block the incoming kick, she stepped forward and slightly to her left, moving inside the arc of Brennan's attack where his leverage was weakest and his balance most compromised. Her right hand shot forward in a motion so fast that most observers didn't see it clearly, striking a specific pressure point on Brennan's inner thigh that instantly disrupted the nerve signals controlling his leg muscles. The technique, known in Filipino martial arts as limb destruction, was designed to temporarily disable an attacker's weapons while setting up more decisive countermeasures. But Sarah was far from finished. As Brennan's kicking leg collapsed beneath him, she smoothly transitioned into a joint lock that Master Delgado had made her practice 10,000 times until it became as natural as breathing. Her left hand secured Brennan's ankle while her right arm threaded beneath his knee, creating a lever system that gave her complete control over his larger and stronger opponent. The physics of the technique were elegant in their simplicity. By controlling Brennan's leg at 2 points and applying pressure in opposite directions, Sarah created a mechanical advantage that multiplied her strength many times over. Brennan's size, which he had always considered his greatest asset, now worked against him as his own body weight became the source of the pressure that was being applied to his knee joint. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the massive drill sergeant, who had seemed so dominant just moments before, found himself completely helpless in the grip of the small medic he had been tormenting for months. Sarah's expression remained calm and professional as she maintained perfect control over the situation, demonstrating the kind of technical mastery that could only come from years of dedicated training under a true expert. Brennan's initial shock quickly turned to panic as he realized that his leg was being bent in a direction that nature had never intended. He tried to use his superior upper body strength to break free from Sarah's hold, but discovered that his positioning made it impossible to generate any meaningful leverage against her technique. Every movement he made only increased the pressure on his knee joint, and his size advantage became completely irrelevant in the face of her superior technical knowledge. The silence of the crowd was broken by Brennan's first cry of pain, as Sarah applied just enough pressure to demonstrate that she could end the confrontation at any moment. The sound was shocking to the hundreds of soldiers who had never heard their intimidating drill sergeant express vulnerability of any kind. The man who had built his reputation on being physically and psychologically unbreakable was being controlled completely by someone a third his size. Captain Torres pushed closer to the center of the confrontation, her medical training making her acutely aware of the potential for serious injury if the situation continued to escalate. She could see that Sarah had achieved complete physical control over Brennan, but she also understood that maintaining that control for much longer would result in permanent damage to his knee joint. The technique being applied was precise and professional, but it was also potentially devastating if taken to its logical conclusion. Major Harrison shouted for the confrontation to stop, but neither combatant seemed to hear his command. Sarah remained focused on maintaining perfect control while monitoring Brennan's physical responses to ensure she didn't accidentally cause permanent injury. Brennan was completely absorbed in trying to escape from a hold that violated every assumption he had ever made about physical dominance and military hierarchy. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. Many of the soldiers had served in combat zones where they had seen death and destruction on a regular basis, but none had ever observed anything quite like this. The complete reversal of expected roles, the technical precision of Sarah's movements, the shocking vulnerability of someone they had considered nearly invincible, all combined to create a moment that would be seared into their memories forever. What happened next would determine not only the immediate outcome of the confrontation, but also the future careers and reputations of both soldiers involved. Sarah held all the power in the situation, both literally and figuratively, and her next decision would echo through the ranks of Fort Braxton for years to come. The quiet medic who had spent her entire military career avoiding attention was about to make a choice that would define how she would be remembered by every soldier who witnessed this extraordinary morning. The moment stretched like a taut wire as Sarah maintained perfect control over Sergeant Brennan's trapped leg, her years of medical training warring with 18 years of martial arts instruction. Every soldier in the crowd held their breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that would fundamentally change the social dynamics of their entire base. The quiet medic who had been invisible for so long now commanded the absolute attention of nearly 500 witnesses, all waiting to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve. Sarah could feel the exact amount of pressure she was applying to Brennan's knee joint, could sense the precise moment when tissue would begin to tear if she increased her leverage even slightly. Her medical knowledge made her acutely aware of the long-term consequences that would result from taking the technique to its devastating conclusion. A torn anterior cruciate ligament would end Brennan's military career, would leave him with permanent mobility issues, would transform him from a physically intimidating presence into someone struggling with basic locomotion for the rest of his life. But her martial arts training whispered different advice. Master Delgado had taught her that showing mercy to an aggressive opponent often resulted in escalated retaliation later. Bullies who were allowed to escape without consequences typically returned with reinforcements, better planning, and increased motivation to prove that their initial defeat had been a fluke. The wise course of action, according to 18 years of Filipino martial arts philosophy, was to end the threat permanently and decisively. Brennan's panicked breathing grew more labored as he realized that his situation was deteriorating rather than improving. His attempts to break free from Sarah's hold had only succeeded in demonstrating how completely she controlled the physics of their confrontation. The drill sergeant who had built his reputation on physical dominance was discovering that technique could overcome strength, that knowledge could defeat size, and that his most fundamental assumptions about power and hierarchy were catastrophically wrong. The crowd sensed the critical nature of the moment as Sarah's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, causing Brennan to emit a sound that was part gasp and part whimper. The man who had terrorized recruits and intimidated seasoned soldiers was being reduced to helplessness by someone he had dismissed as weak and unworthy. The reversal was so complete, so shocking, that many observers would later say they had trouble believing their own memories of what they had witnessed. Captain Torres recognized the medical emergency that was developing and pushed through the crowd with increasing urgency. She had seen enough combat injuries to know that Sarah was applying a technique that could result in permanent disability if maintained for much longer. But she also understood the complex dynamics of military hierarchy that made intervention complicated. Sarah was defending herself against an unprovoked attack, was well within her rights to use whatever force was necessary to protect herself from injury. Major Harrison faced an equally complex decision as the senior officer present. Military protocol required him to maintain discipline and order, but the situation had evolved far beyond normal disciplinary procedures. Brennan had initiated the physical confrontation by attempting to kick a subordinate in full view of hundreds of witnesses. Sarah was responding with what appeared to be measured and appropriate force to defend herself. Intervening on Brennan's behalf might send the message that senior enlisted soldiers could physically assault their subordinates without consequences. The breaking point came when Brennan, desperate to escape and preserve what remained of his dignity, made a critical error that would seal his fate. Instead of submitting to Sarah's control and allowing the confrontation to end, he reached for the combat knife that every soldier carried as part of their standard equipment. The movement was clumsy and telegraphed, compromised by his awkward position and the pain radiating from his trapped leg, but the intent was unmistakable. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible as they realized that the confrontation had just escalated from a disciplinary incident to a potentially lethal encounter. Drawing a weapon during what had been an unarmed confrontation violated every regulation in the military code of conduct, transformed Brennan from a drill sergeant asserting authority into a soldier threatening deadly force against a subordinate. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. Her medical oath demanded that she preserve life whenever possible, but her survival instincts and martial arts training recognized a deadly threat that required neutralization. Instead of simply maintaining pressure on Brennan's knee, she smoothly transitioned into a technique that Master Delgado had always described as the lesson that teaches itself. The adjustment was subtle but devastating. Sarah shifted her grip slightly, changing the angle of pressure on Brennan's joint from uncomfortable to catastrophic. The sound that followed would haunt the dreams of many witnesses for months to come. The sharp crack of cartilage and bone surrendering to precisely applied leverage echoed across the training area, followed immediately by Brennan's scream of agony as his knee joint separated in ways that nature had never intended. The combat knife fell from Brennan's nerveless fingers as shock and pain overwhelmed his nervous system. His body went limp as his brain struggled to process the sudden transition from aggression to devastating injury. The drill sergeant who had seemed so physically imposing just moments before was now writhing on the ground, clutching his ruined leg and making sounds that reminded everyone present that he was, ultimately, as vulnerable as anyone else. Sarah released her hold immediately and stepped back, her expression shifting seamlessly from focused combatant to concerned medical professional. The transition was so smooth that many observers would later marvel at her ability to compartmentalize her roles as fighter and healer. She knelt beside Brennan not as the person who had just destroyed his knee, but as the medic responsible for treating his injury. Her assessment was quick and thorough. The anterior cruciate ligament was completely torn, the medial meniscus was severely damaged, and there was significant instability in the joint structure that would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. Brennan's military career was effectively over, his days of physical intimidation permanently concluded by 30 seconds of perfectly applied technique. As Sarah began providing immediate medical care to the man who had just tried to stab her, the crowd of witnesses began to understand the full scope of what they had observed. The quiet medic had not only defeated someone twice her size and weight, but had done so with such technical precision that she had achieved her objective without exceeding the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat he posed. Captain Torres arrived at Sarah's side as she worked to stabilize Brennan's injury, her expression mixing admiration with concern for the aftermath that would inevitably follow. She had never seen such a textbook example of defensive force applied with surgical precision, but she also understood that the military bureaucracy would struggle to process an incident that defied so many conventional assumptions about physical capability and appropriate response to threats. Major Harrison took control of the scene as medical personnel arrived to transport Brennan to the base hospital. His preliminary report would note that Sergeant Brennan had initiated an unprovoked physical assault against a subordinate, had escalated the confrontation by drawing a weapon, and had sustained injuries during Specialist Martinez's lawful defense of herself against deadly force. The facts were clear and well documented by hundreds of witnesses, but the implications would reverberate through the chain of command for months to come. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama concluded, but the conversations that followed would ensure that every soldier on the base knew the details within hours. The story would grow and evolve in the telling, but the core facts would remain consistent. The small medic who everyone had overlooked had possessed skills that none of them had suspected, had used those skills with restraint and precision when threatened, and had fundamentally altered the social dynamics of their military community. Sarah completed her medical assessment of Brennan's injury and supervised his transfer to the hospital, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. She knew that her life at Fort Braxton would never be the same, that she had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to anonymity. But she also felt a sense of relief that the months of harassment and intimidation had finally ended in a way that would prevent any repetition. The formal investigation that followed would exonerate Sarah completely, finding that she had acted appropriately in defending herself against an unprovoked attack by a superior who had violated every principle of military leadership. Brennan would be court-martialed for assault and conduct unbecoming, his career ending in disgrace rather than the heroic conclusion he had once envisioned. But the real impact of that September morning would be measured not in official proceedings, but in the changed attitudes and behaviors of hundreds of soldiers who had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen proof that strength came in many forms, that respect could not be demanded but only earned, and that the most dangerous opponents were often those who looked the least threatening. Sarah Martinez would never be invisible again. Her reputation would spread beyond Fort Braxton to every base where the soldiers who witnessed her confrontation with Brennan were eventually stationed. She would become a legend, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration to countless military personnel who learned that true strength had little to do with size, gender, or rank. The quiet medic who had spent years avoiding attention had become the subject of a story that would be told and retold for decades, a reminder that respect isn't given based on physical intimidation, but earned through courage, skill, and the unbreakable spirit of someone who refuses to be broken. Sometimes the smallest person in the room carries the biggest surprise, and sometimes justice arrives in the form of a perfectly executed defensive move that no one sees coming.